everyone. As I'm sure everyone knows, today is Mother's Day, so I want to wish a very happy day to all of the mothers that are here. Also, as I'm sure a lot of you know, yesterday marked the 100th anniversary of the first apparition of Our Lady to the shepherd children at Fatima. So I thought it would be appropriate today to sort of maybe focus a little bit on Our Lady, the mother of Jesus, our mother. And of course we know as Christians and as Catholics that devotion to Mary is sort of an essential element to our faith. It's something that's been there in the life of the church from the very, very earliest days. And a lot of us, I'm sure, are though familiar, maybe not from our own experience, but what we've read about or seen or heard of what this was like, or the Marian devotion in, let's say, the first part of the 20th century. And parishes had sodalities of Our Lady, where women, young women, older women would get together and foster devotion and learn about Our Lady. Different rosary congresses that would gather people from coming all over to pray the rosary. Processions in the streets for the great Marian feast days, big liturgies, all sorts of novenas and Marian devotions. And a lot of it, at least in the first part of the 20th century, was driven by Marian apparitions, in particular Our Lady of Fatima in 1917. Because of the miracle and the messages, devotion to Our Lady of Fatima spread throughout the world and throughout the church. A lot of people wanted to know what that third secret was and whether or not the Pope would ever reveal it. And it sort of all culminated in 1950 when Pope Pius XII formally proclaimed the dogma of the Assumption, sort of a great canonization of Mary, a belief that she was assumed in heaven, body and soul. But then something began to change. Between that time and the mid-60s, and this is something noticed by Cardinal Ratzinger, of course, who later became Pope, in 1968, he talked about this great devotion to Mary and how people just sort of resoundingly approved the declaration of the Assumption of Mary as a dogma. But in 1968, Marian devotion had almost died off. You couldn't even imagine in 1968 people gathering in the streets to celebrate the proclamation of a Marian dogma. They begin to see all the sodalities and the devotions begin to fade away. And he noticed that 50 years ago in 1968, is that how much it's even gotten worse over the course of the past 50 years. This Marian devotion, which was once such an essential element of the church, you see pockets of it here and there, but do you still see it in the same way it once was? Not at all. Most families don't pray the rosary anymore. You don't see large novenas. They're not processions as they used to be. And it can make individuals who know a lot about Our Lady of Fatima and her promise that the Immaculate Heart would triumph. When is that going to happen? Was that just nothing much more than a bunch of pious talk to the shepherd children, get it right? Where is this increase of Marian devotion in the church? And so I could sit and spend some time sort of looking at the roots of the problem. Why is it that the devotion that was so strong to Our Lady simply doesn't exist in the church at the beginning of the 21st century as it used to? But the truth is, I think that the decline in Marian devotion is part and parcel of a much larger issue. It's the decline in the practice of the faith, at least in Catholicism and other mainline churches that we see throughout the West. Not in Africa and other countries, but at least in the West. People don't come to Mass as often as they should. Look around you today. A moral crisis in the church, rebellion against the teaching authority of the church, struggling in the understanding of liturgy and the sacraments and basic Eucharistic belief. It doesn't exist like it used to before the Second Vatican Council. It's part of an overall crisis, this Marian struggle, a crisis of belief in the church. So, what I am sort of looking at is the question today of what should Marian piety and what should devotion to Our Lady look like today? In one sense, I don't think it should look like what it is today, which is basically non-existent. But on the other hand, I do not think it's something that we needed to go back to 1940 to have that same sort of piety or devotion. We're not living in a time like it was in the 40s. So I don't think sort of a reactionary movement is good. I'm not saying that we should abandon rosaries and processions and devotions. Those things are good and necessary and important. But I want to look at today what I think, again, would be sort of essential elements of a proper Marian piety, because we as the church need this. In the beginning of the 21st century, with a proper understanding of the faith, what does devotion to Mary look like? And I'm not going to get into particulars. I'm going to address that at the very, very end of sort of how this would be embodied, how it would be practiced. But the essential elements, I think, are three. The first is this. A 21st century authentic devotion to Our Lady is going to focus primarily on the humanity of Mary, on her humanness. I think quite often in the history of the church, and maybe at the beginning of the 20th century, Mary was sort of seen as almost a super saint. It was like a quasi-deity. She was there in heaven and she was perfect and light was radiating from her and she was standing on a cloud and she was so far removed from our everyday experience. It was hard to connect. Also, when you look at the art throughout history, and I think there have been beautiful images of Our Lady, that Our Lady can sort of become reduced to this artistic image. She's really not real. She's two-dimensional. She really wasn't a human person. Or even more, possibly, she could be reduced to a theological abstraction. We could talk all about Mary and her different virtues, but she loses her humanity. And so what happens is we lose touch with Mary. Again, I'm not saying these things aren't good or important, but today there needs to be more of a focus on the humanity of Mary. That she was a human. She laughed, she cried, she had joy, she had struggles. She cooked meals, she raised children, she loved her husband. All these different things that made her human. She experienced life as a child. She grew old. She experienced the sort of full range of what we do as humans, albeit she was sinless and she remained a virgin. I think probably one of the most accurate or sort of embodiment of what I'm talking about is the portrayal of Marian and Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ. It really resounded with people. She was very, very human. She was there. She cried. She wiped up Christ's blood. She could joke with Jesus. She was there following him. A very human portrayal. This is something that speaks to us today. So proper Marian piety is one that's going to focus on Mary's humanity. The second one, and again, I'm not trying to cause any controversy by saying this, is that a Marian devotion today is going to be more personal than liturgical. I guess it's sort of tied to this idea of seeing the humanity of Mary. Again, not that we shouldn't have processions or novenas or you shouldn't pray the rosary. These things are important. Yesterday, for the 100th anniversary, there were 1 million people that showed up at Fatima for all of these different devotions. It was a beautiful ceremony. But instead, we can have our devotions, but it has to be rooted in a personal relationship with Mary as our mother, as a human being, connected to her in prayer. It's one of the things that we see. It's so easy for us to get caught up in all the rituals, and that's important, but it loses its heart. It loses its meaning. And that's why we talk about a personal relationship with Jesus. We can come and, of course, approach him as a church and approach him liturgically and encounter him in the Eucharist. That's important, but it must be based in a personal relationship, a connection to Jesus in prayer, that we have to know him on that intimate level. And so it is the same thing. We can and we must have a relationship with Mary. We must know her as our mother and cultivate that through prayer. And that is going to help make the rosary so much more meaningful, make our devotions and our novenas have more weight because we know Mary as a person, alive, resurrected, and interested in our lives. And then third and finally, this is one that maybe is a little broader, is that a true devotion to Mary in the 21st century is going to focus on Mary as a woman, focusing in on her femininity, on her motherhood, and her virginity. There's a lot that goes along with this. If we really pay attention, I think all of sort of the cultural crises that we face in the world and the church that have been so often in the news over the course of the past 30 or 40 years deal with things that find their nexus in Our Lady. What it means to be human, what it means to be a woman, the idea of gender, motherhood, fertility, family life, virginity and purity, morality, particularly in the realm of the Sixth Commandment. All of it finds its focus in Mary. And so I do indeed believe we need to be engaged in the cultural debate when it comes to socioeconomic and social issues, also political. But as Catholics, we've got to be careful we don't get caught up in all of the minutiae and the rules and regulations. That if we really want to understand properly how we're supposed to live, we need to see these things embodied in our Blessed Mother. How does she as a woman, how does she as a person, as a mother and a virgin, live these things out? I think a deeper Mariology and a greater devotion to Our Lady is going to help us understand better where our position should be in these other controversial moral issues. Rather than just saying, this is how you're supposed to act, or this is what the church teaches, to see how Mary lived these things out. What it was like in this deep reality of who Mary was as a human person. This is something that I think has the possibility of really guiding us with a true humanity in understanding these difficult teachings. And so, whether it be these or other things in the culture of the church, in 1984, Cardinal Ratzinger talked or did an interview about all these different crises as we as a culture were facing. It was in the book, which I still think is relevant, called The Ratzinger Report. And he talked about all these cultural issues I'm discussing, and he said, I can sum up the solution in one word. One word. And that word was Mary. Mary as a person. Not just her intervention and her prayers, but also looking to her as the embodiment of what it means to be human. Because ultimately, that's the real issue. And it's something that Ratzinger talks about a little bit later on. So I want to bring this to a little conclusion with this quote. Because this is what it's all about. This idea of authentic Marian piety that can change our lives, that can change the church, and can also hopefully change the culture. He says it may just be the task of Marian piety, and he's talking about in the 21st century, or the latter part of the 20th century, to awaken the heart and purity in faith. If the misery of contemporary man is his increasing disintegration into what he calls mere bios, to see us as just biological material, a product of the processes of evolution, or mere rationality. There's no soul, there's no love, that everything is empirical, reduced to science and technology, Marian piety could work against this decomposition and help men to rediscover unity and the center from the heart. So the real issue is anthropology. That we do not understand who we are in relation to God, in relation to each other, in relation to the church and society. And this is something that echoed over and over and over again in the thought of John Paul II. And that Mary is the real solution. She shows what it's like to be human, what it's like to be in relation to God and to others, and therefore can indeed renew our faith, renew our understanding of who we are, and also hopefully renew the church and the culture. Now, this is all nice and possibly very theological, and I can't tell you exactly how this is going to look in reality. But the truth is, the solution isn't going to come from the top down. I'm not going to, or the Pope's not going to come to and say, you do this devotion, do this and that, and all of a sudden everything's going to be fine. As it often happens throughout the history of the church, it has to come from the bottom up, from the laity, who have an authentic practice of the faith. and to see the different devotions or ways this will be embodied in different cultures and in different families. And so my encouragement to you is to take these principles and in your own family, in your own life, see what it looks like, and to begin to spread that devotion, that true devotion to Our Lady. And indeed, if it's something Spirit-filled, we will begin to see that renewal that starts from the bottom and goes up rather than the top down, and one that is guided and centered on Our Lady, who is the perfect human person, and a relationship to her that can renew our lives, the church, and hopefully the world. Amen.